Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for the invitation to give the talk. Little did I think when I came as a student here way back in 1968 that I would end up talking to such an august audience about a building that I've come to really appreciate over the years. And it's a building that kind of grows on you, and certainly as a student I wasn't aware just how good it was, and I'll talk a little bit about how it kind of gets into you without you realising just it is a nice building. Ellen Rowley gave a talk in February that I really enjoyed, and she gave the kind of context of the building at the time in 1964 to 1967 when the building was being completed. She talked about other brutalist buildings around the world. She talked about building in Dublin that was going on, and in particularly she contrasted the building of the Berkeley, which was built in situ with the concrete poured in situ, against the American Embassy, which was being built at roughly the same time down in Ballsbridge, both by Cramptons, but the American Embassy in Ballsbridge was precast elements that were actually cast, I think, in Holland and then shipped over to Dublin and put together by Cramptons. So it was a very different kind of building. But so she gave us the kind of context of the building, and I want to talk a little bit about the context here. Here we are. Right. So, when I was preparing for this talk, I thought I would ask some of the new library staff who were new at the time, what did they think of the building? So I spoke in particular to Breed Keneally, and I hope she doesn't mind me mentioning her name. I'll mention a few more names. I asked her, Breed had joined the library in September or October 1967, just about 3 months after the library had opened. And I asked her, what was the conversation among the library staff about this new building that they'd all inhabited? And she replied, the only topic of conversation at that time when she joined the library was the fact that the deputy librarian had eloped with one of the student helpers. The deputy librarian at the time was William Dieneman, and the student he eloped with was a lady called Marissa Okami, and she was a student in mental and moral science, which is philosophy nowadays, and she was a student helper. And her father, she wasn't just any old student, her father was a diplomat in the American Embassy, the same one that was built at a similar time, and I believe he kind of landed on the librarian's office mat demanding the return of his daughter. But I gathered that as soon as the first child was arrived, I'm just trying to see what the name is now. I think Rachel arrived. The family were fully reconciled. And here we are. Here's a picture of William Dieneman and his wife Marissa just behind him there. He went off to become librarian in Aberystwyth University, and this is actually taken at his retirement at Aberystwyth University. I couldn't find any other photographs of him in 1955. And then Marissa behind him. Marissa sadly died in March last year, so she just died about a year ago. And William, of course, wasn't the last deputy librarian to sweep a young girl off her feet, because, of course, we remember Isabel and Peter Fox, at least, going off. And over the years in the library community, there's been several marriages between colleagues, and I've written down here, and a few near misses as well. The library is a community of professional staff, and it's within the college community. And in typical Irish way, we are a community that has its own dysfunctionalities. So we do that. So a little bit more serious, the context again. I've used Peter Fox's book on the history of the library hugely in preparation of this talk, and it's a mine of information. But the period did, just as this building was being designed and planned and then made, there was a huge changeover of senior staff at the time, which is remarkable for this change of staff while there was major changes going on in the library. And the library services and the way it managed things was being changed beyond all recognition to what had gone before. And there are just some of the staff that have changed in just kind of 5 years. Herbert Park was appointed librarian in 1940. He was a fellow of the college. He was professor of ancient history, I think it is. Yes, for ancient history. And but actually, although he was an academic and a member of the board first and a fellow first, he was actually a very, very good librarian. He took the library in hand, brought his considerable influence at the board to enhance the library. He sought extra staff, he sought extra funding, and of course, he persuaded the board to go for a new building. And the campaign for the new building started with the film Building for Books, which some of us have seen a lot. And this was taken over by the Rank Cinema organisation, and it was available for showing, and I think it was shown in many of the Rank cinemas at the time, which was a major publicity activity at the time. It was like the internet of the day in the cinemas. And the architectural competition followed in 1960, and then the building started in 1964. And you can see the changes there, that Herbert Park retired or resigned, was pushed, I'm not quite sure, in 1965, just after the building had started. And John Hurst, who had been the deputy librarian, was appointed as librarian in June of 65. In June of 65, and Hurst and Dieneman, the two of them, had an awful lot to do with the planning of the building and answering and talking to the architects all the time, toing and froing. I've seen some of the correspondence back and forth as they were meeting in London and they were meeting in Dublin, to go back and forth. But as Peter Fox says, Hurst's tenure as librarian was brief and uncomfortable. And John Hurst left to become the first librarian in the new University of Ulster at Coleraine, just you can see in March 1967. And I think it is amazing that the board managed to appoint a new librarian by July of the same year after the librarian had left. That wouldn't happen nowadays. And so Dennis Roberts arrived in Trinity in June 1967, just a month before the library was opened on the 12th of July. And I owe a particular debt of a personal debt of gratitude to Dennis Roberts, because I was still in school in Middleton in Cork as a boarder, and the last class came up to Dublin for a set of careers talks in Trinity. And one of the talks, the only talk I remember, was one that was given by Dennis Roberts, and he must have only just been in the library, because it would have been June, well, probably the Leaving Cert exams were on, that we came up for these career talks. And he spoke about a career in librarianship, and he explained that the world's ever-increasing literature needed people to manage that development of literature, and even they needed science students, which I was intending to be. So I was aware of librarianship as a career, as a potential career, all the time I was an undergraduate. And so I owe a particular debt to Dennis Roberts for that. So Dennis then left. He came from the National Library of Scotland. He was secretary, I think, when he was appointed librarian here, and then he went back to Scotland. He was enticed back to become librarian of the National Library of Scotland, where he was there for several years. And then Peter Brown was appointed, and Peter Brown, of course, I owe a debt of gratitude, because he was the one who hired me as a graduate trainee way back in and he was here for 14 years before he died. So he was the first librarian for quite a while that we had a good period of stability and continuity with the powers that be on the board and that. So there was a really high turnover of staff just at an important time. But I think the library in college was well served by all of them. So we just go back now to the building. This was a brochure that was produced in 1958, same time as a film, and it shows a crowded 1937 reading room. Of course, the photograph is designed to show a crowded, and it showed a crowded classroom room. And just some of you may remember, there's a fellow there just at the counter of the 1937 reading room, and that, of course, is Ron O'Shaughnessy, who retired maybe 10, 15 years ago and went to live in Canada. And over here in the classroom room, if you know the old library, the Henry Jones room, you probably know. The classroom room, I believe, was the room above the Henry Jones room. The Henry Jones room was the librarian's office with a fireplace, and then below that was the Quinn room, which was the main other library workspace apart from classing, and the deputy librarian had a room in that Quinn room on the ground floor of the old library. And I think it was Veronica told me there was a speaking tube between the different rooms of the library. This man here is Mr. Walsh, and this is Hazel Hornsby. This lady here is Hazel Hornsby, who was the chief cataloguer at the time. Both of them retired in about 1967, just as a new library opened. Now, I don't have the names of the other staff to hand on that picture, but two ladies who did work in the classroom at this time were Eileen Fox, who married Sarah Bedford, and we have their daughter, Ars Bedford, who looks after admissions to this day. And another lady who was there was Teresa O'Doherty, who married John Hurst. So you can see there's kind of a pattern emerging here. This is the competition brochure that was produced in 1960. And just there's just the page that's the cover and the next page. What I think is interesting on this page is the provost, of course, McConnell, is signing on behalf of the board members. When you look down the board members, there's just one lady, Fran Moran, is the one lady on the board at that time. All the rest are men, of course. And then if we move along, this is what we were looking for in a new library when this came out. And it includes, where are we now? If I press this one here. It says that there are now 2,600 students, and this number is soon expected to reach 2,700. And the present inadequate reading room company has to be rationed for many students. And in the new building, it is proposed to provide storage for at least 1.2 million bound volume, i.e. 60 years intake at the present rate, accommodation for 320 records. So the building should be full around about now, maybe another few years, and the building will be full, don't you know. Peter Fox remarks in his book that John Hurst knew well before the building was completed and opened that the optimism for the longevity of the building was severely misplaced, and that the building would be inadequate for the demands of an expanding university as soon as it opened. There's a picture of the site before the Berkeley Library was in. It is actually very difficult to take this picture. Now, this is from the printing house, looking up. It's very difficult. This is obviously taken on a winter's day when there's no leaves on the trees, but the planting now on both sides of that walkway, it makes it impossible to take this photograph. Up here you can see Provost Salmon, which is now in Front Square, and that one. And then this is what it looked like at the end. And here's the decisions and report of the jury, which is interesting on several levels. If we just look at what they say about Paul Korilek's entry. I know you're not supposed to read out what's on slides, but here I go. The design is consciously modern in style and construction, and the author shows enough good taste and judgment to encourage confidence that when built, the new library will be a notable addition to the architecture of the college. And that is very true. I love this bit. A happy feature shared with other successful designs is the entrance courtyard formed by the new and existing buildings, a feature which in this case is extended as a podium for the main building. The jury questions the wisdom of introducing a pool into this court, especially in the view of the bookstore below. So as we know, the pool wasn't included, but we have flooded that podium since, and I have a picture of that to come. And the jury finished its comments with, all in all, the jury considers that the design best fulfills the requirement of the accommodation programme prescribed, that it can be built within the limits of cost stipulated. That was then, I don't think it quite matched the cost, but never mind. It was close enough to the budget. And that it meets the desired promoters expressed in section 33 of the conditions, which was that the new building will represent the 20th century to posterity as characteristically as the present library represents the 18th century. And of course the present library is what we call the old library. So I think the jury was very wise in its comments in particular and in its choice. And just, I can't let this go, just the heading of this section, the premiated entries. I had to look up what the word meant, I'm afraid. But it is exactly right. Premiated means the prize-winning entries. And like, why use prize-winning when you've got a much better work to do? And in my time in Trinity, I have come to appreciate that most, not all, but most of the reports and the minutes that you read, or minutes produced by the college boards and meetings, is generally of a very, very high standard of English. It really is. And it is something to be nourished, and it needs to be nourished and practiced for the maintenance of that. And just as an aside, Philip Larkin, of course, who was a poet, but he was also a librarian at Hull University. I don't like his poetry, as we were discussing at Commons, but he did apparently say that universities should be literate in the same way that hospitals should be hygienic. Which is good. The only thing is, nowadays hospitals aren't so hygienic as we would like them to be, but never mind. And just a tiny note on the jury. The report says that there were 218 entries. Well, in fact, before the jury produced his report, when the invitation to tender or to apply for the building for the architecture competition, there was 537 expressions of interest, and people who asked questions, because there was another booklet produced, official answers to questions, that when one architect asked a question of the jury, they published all the answers together so everybody was on a level playing field, and that booklet itself is of great interest. And what is remarkable about the jury response is that while they gave detailed comments on the winning entry and the two other prize-winning ones, they also actually wrote a couple of sentences about almost all of the other entries. And I gave a talk or a tour of the Berkeley Library some years back to some retired architects on a jolly that they had, and some of them had said they had entered the competition and were delighted to get a few comments from the jury, because normally when you enter these competitions you just hear dead silence. You either win it or you hear dead silence, and they were delighted to get some comments. This is a picture that I love. It's a kind of a preliminary sketch, and it shows the plan was to have storage in a basement area below ground, and then on the ground level you have this podium. The administration area was to be in here, and then above that was to be floating, so to speak, in midair, the reading rooms, the readers. So the idea was the messy bit was all down here, and the administration, and then you went up to the reading room and you had no more distractions when you were reading. The cataloguing area, the busy workrooms and so on were all below the readers, and so the readers were upstairs away from all of that, studying away. And then the sun is up here on the south side at the back of the building. And then if you look at the building itself, this is exactly how it turned out. And you will see that the sun will be up here on the south side. All of these windows here are north facing, which gives a lovely, even, cool light, independent of where the sun is in the sky. And it's little things like that that I think readers don't realise that the building is doing for you. It's keeping the light kind of steady without you kind of realising, but it's just there and the light is just right. So it's that kind of little thing. And it was when I was in library school doing my taught masters in Sheffield that I began to realise why this library works, because we did about 3 hours or 4 hours on what makes a good library, and I realised just how many boxes the Berkeley ticked at the time, and I'll mention a few of those as I go along. But first I want to talk a little bit about the actual building process. I visited the Irish Architectural Archive, which is a fabulous, fabulous place. There's a beautiful exhibition space, of course, and their facilities and their collections are just amazing. They have the output of, I don't know, dozens of Irish architectural companies there, and including, of course, ABK. And they have, and I discovered that they had this little box. I know Ellen Rowley mentioned it too. They have this little box of photographs in it, like little black and white 5x3 photographs, and they were taken possibly by Paul Carolek or possibly by the Clerk of Works, but to my delight and to any librarian's delight, they all are annotated on the back with what the subject matter is. So they are truly a librarian's delight with all what we call nowadays, this is the metadata of the pictures. So this is just, the photographs are, I just took photographs of the pictures with my iPad, so that's why they're not great quality, but you get the idea. These were the three people in charge of the building. There's the foreman, the quantity surveyor, and the site engineer, March 1964. And this, now when I saw this picture, this reminded me of several things. This is, you can see the annotation on the bottom with March 64, cement tanker putting the first fill in the silo. Now, we heard Ellen Rowley talking about the decision to pour the concrete for this building in situ rather than use precast elements. And in fact, the design as submitted, I think, anticipated using precast elements, but once the architect had seen the site, and of course we know that Paul Carolek and the people from ABK had never been to Trinity, never been to Dublin when they submitted the competition, the winning competition entry. So when they saw the site and all of that, apparently it was decided to build it in situ with concrete poured in situ. Now, the logistics of making the building with poured concrete in situ has an interesting little tale. Some of you might remember a man called Tom Ward. He worked in the computer laboratory. Well, in 1964, Tom Ward was a newly qualified engineer, and he was in charge of the North Wall depot for CIE. And one of his jobs was to manage the arrival of the regular shipments of cement for Trinity from a place called Platten near Drogheda, where Irish Cement had their works. They also had one in Limerick. And CIE was very keen on this contract because they thought here was an area of expansion. There was going to be more building in Dublin in the 1960s, and here was an opportunity for a business of bringing cement to new sites in the city. And so they minded this contract very well. And the tanks of cement came down on the train from Platten down into the North Wall depot. It was powdered cement, of course, and it was blown by compressed air into a tanker like this and then driven to Trinity for working. And Tom told me of a time on a Good Friday afternoon, he found himself the only man or woman at the North Wall depot in CIE, and a train was coming in with cement for the Trinity building site for a major weekend pour over the Easter weekend. And he was the only man there, and he started blowing the concrete powder from the train into one of the lorries, and of course a valve went off and he found himself showered in concrete dust. He said it took him 3 hours. By the time he got home, it said he was 3 hours in a bath trying to scrub himself clean. So much for health and safety at the time. So all the deliveries were just in time about that. Tom then, when he left CIE and worked for B&I Lines for a time, and he told me a story about bringing new ships from Japan over to Dublin for new car ferries in the 1980s, I suppose. And he made it to the board of the B&I, and then he retired from there, and he was a great pal of Michael Doherty, who was number 2 in the computer laboratory, and Michael Doherty persuaded him to do an undergraduate degree in computer science at the time, and he did that, and he was a junior programmer. Although he was senior in years, he was a junior programmer, and he was a serious help to the library during the time when we had a Dynex system and then a GX system helping us, and I know he helped me with several projects to do with computerization. Just another site picture, and just the foreman inspects the first part of the rack. You notice that there's not a hard hat or a high-vis jacket in sight, but that was the way. Now this picture also caught my interest. It's labelled Top Light F/14. F14 would have been the reference on the elevation as to where it was to go. The first one to be cast. Just I know from other talks, I think Eileen or Ellen Rowley said that several of the preliminary casts of concrete were knocked down because nobody agreed that they were good enough. But this light here, this is of interest to me anyway, I think. So this would have looked into a basement area, and here's a photograph that I took. This is a hopeless photograph, but this is in what is now the north or the south training rooms. One of those training rooms where you see the deep light. And I just think, what other buildings do we know that have lights, windows like this? And here's one of them. If you look at this is the iconic Corbusier building, of course. This is what started him off, and this is where he got the idea of the plasticity of concrete and cement. And you can see, like the whole world goes around to see this building. And then you see, this is just like what we get in the North training room. And we know that Paul Correlect and his 2 pals, Peter Arends and Richard Burton, when they were students in the architectural school in London, they hired a van at some stage during the summer and went around France visiting all the Corbusier buildings as students. So they were like, that's obviously took their attention, and they were a great fan of Corbusier which is quite obvious when you look at their buildings now. And I know that Helen, our current librarian, always likes a reference to Harvard in any of these talks. So this is for you, Helen. I travel to Boston frequently, and I have been in Boston frequently, but I was in there and looking at my kind of diary at the time in 2009. I was in Boston for, I think it must have been an RLG conference, which is the Research Libraries Group. And just as an aside, the wonderful thing about working in Trinity, and the even more wonderful thing about working in Trinity Library, is it opens doors to you in the library community. People want to know what is Trinity up to. They want to hear what you're doing. We are an interesting library, and actually I think we do quite interesting things too. We do novel things, and I think we often do novel things compared to other libraries because we're not as well funded as other libraries, and as a result we have to find novel ways of spending that money wisely. And I've been to North America many times for library conferences, and they want to hear, how did we do that sort of thing? So it's been good. Excuse me for a minute. Anyway, on a Sunday afternoon in 2009 in the summer, I found myself wandering around Harvard's campus, and I came across this building, the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts. And I had a huge sense, I know these photographs don't really show it, but I had a huge sense of deja vu when I saw this building. And when I looked it up after my time there, I discovered that the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts was built in 1963. It's the only building on the North American continent designed by Corbusier. No wonder it looked familiar. And now, yes, just let me see now. Yes, here we are. Just one last picture from the Irish Architecture Archive. We know that the concrete was all poured in situ. The Berkeley Library is full of board mark concrete, which is where the forms, and this is one of the forms, is made of wood, as you can see, Douglas fir, and then the concrete takes up the grain and the indentations in the planks of wood. That is due to intense detailed architectural planning, but it is also due to the fabulous craftsmanship that the Cramptons, carpenters and joiners did on the formwork. And I've heard several people talk, and there's a book about it, that the craftsmen that, and Paul Kororek himself talks about it, the craftsmen that Cramptons had at the time were second to none. They were fabulous joiners and carpenters. And this is just one of the forms. This is the form actually that is in the main stairs when you come past the turnstile and turn right. This is the form that was used to pour that part of concrete. So a couple of pictures of the exterior. This is taken very soon after the building was opened. You can see there's absolutely no furniture on the top, no furniture at all there. And then this is a more recent picture, possibly taken by myself, I'm not sure. And you can see there's two items. There's the Pomodoro sculpture, and there's also this funny little thing there, little box, and of course these skylights there. And here's a picture taken just here we are in between those two pictures, and we can see there is something, of course, on this little thing there. And And just when the library first opened, not all of the space was given over to library use. Some of it had been promised to the college for lecture halls. And there was an exhibition space in the basement as well. And in fact, in the rooms there, I remember as an undergraduate attending some maths lectures by Brian Murdoch. There's a junior fresh in the basement of the Berkeley Library. Of course, it was still the new library at that stage. And the art gallery was in an area under the podium as well at the beginning. And they had some fabulous exhibitions there. I remember one on Picasso, which was quite unique to have such an exhibition. And Paul Ferguson was telling me the other day that he remembers the Paul Henry retrospective that was there in about 1973 or so. And he remembers Maple Young, who was Paul Henry's widow, being shown around in a wheelchair to see the paintings. But soon after the library opened and the art exhibition, the gallery opened, there was a Henry Moore exhibition. And as part of that exhibition, Henry Moore loaned this piece, which was, we called it The King and the Queen, but I think Henry Moore called it The Two-Seated Figures. And just, it's interesting if I can read out what Paul Correlec said about these two figures. Paul Correlec wrote this about the time. At the time of his exhibition in the library building, Henry Moore brought one of his masterpieces, The King and Queen, to Trinity and placed it on the library forecourt, where it remained for several years after the end of the exhibition. I even began to hope that he might forget to remove it. However, no such luck. He had not been happy with the location because he felt there was a conflict with the forecourt lanterns and because there was not enough sunlight on the north-facing forecourt. Eventually George, that was Professor George Dawson, of course, in genetics, obtained another work by Henry Moore for which a location in Library Square was agreed, and there it has remained. For some time, the Berkeley forecourt was embellished only by an empty plinth, which still awaits removal or preferably conversion into a proper bench. George worked persistently to find a replacement for the King and Queen and eventually proposed the work by Pomodoro, which is now permanently installed in the forecourt and which appears to have been made for it. A perfect outcome. Now, I mentioned about a pool in the Berkeley podium that was proposed by the architect. These are two photographs that I took in 2014. The podium had begun to leak. It had been leaking, I think, for a while. I don't think the Pomodoro statue or the Pomodoro sculpture helped with the leaking, but never mind. And they lifted all the slabs, put in various membranes and so on. And then when it was finished, they deliberately flooded the podium for about 3 days with water with green dye in it to see did it leak. And it didn't. So they're waterproof in the podium. So it has a Venice look-alike about it. Just a few pictures about the outside of the library that catch people's attention and catch my attention. One of the things to notice about the Berkeley Library is how white the concrete is. They attempted to get the same whiteness in the Usher Library, but we just couldn't afford to get the right materials to make it so white. It is very, very white compared to modern concrete. It's much grayer than that. So it's very white. This is part of the air handling outlets. Just at the front, and like features are made of drain pipes, and then we have these lovely rounded glass windows, and I've heard people say that these are like eyebrows above the windows. And of course, the way these openings are, these are just like the windows that I showed you going into the basement, except in the other direction, going into the research floor. These deep, making the window deeper than it actually is by putting it on a slope through the wall. And of course, the boardwalk concrete, 50 years of weathering, and it's still very sharp and well defined. And of course, that's all down to very, very serious quality control of the materials and the sand and the concrete composition that was being used. And no matter where you look at the building, it's interesting. There's a view at the back, of course. And then internally, and you notice too just how sharp the corners are, how sharp the edges. Still, there's very little wear on those. Whereas you get a more modern building and you see the corners are chipped and worn and so on. Some interior views. That's just the Morrison reading room, and I've heard Ellen Rowley describe it like a cathedral to learning because of the high ceiling, and it is a bit like that. And you have the north-facing windows, so you have good light. And then this is the same building, but here we have the research floor up on the next level. The double height, like as well as the cathedral space, it's really super placed. Like this is one of the things that tick the boxes for a good library. The student and the reader is not in a cramped, low ceiling little combined space. They're in this open, liberated space when you're studying, which is conducive to studying or something. And the Morrison room, of course, when it opened, it was a periodicals reading room. And there was flaps. There was specialised bookcases with flaps, and the current issues were on the lid of the flap, and you lifted it up, and the back issues were in the back. And I worked for a period in the periodicals room, the workroom, which is now so I think it's the systems office there. And I remember one time when I was in periodicals, I think Irene Tucker might have been the chief the periodicals librarian at the time. But anyway, Professor Chubb kind of appeared round the door, kind of a little bit nervous, looking around to see who was there. He was returning a periodical part that he had borrowed. And would we please not tell Margot, who was his wife, of course, and head of reader services at the time, that he had broken a library rule. And of course, I ended up as keeper of reader services some years later, and I'm sure some of my junior colleagues broke some rules, but all in a good cause for a worthy reader, of course. And here's the reading room. Again, just the ceiling is so interesting. Like, it's not a flat ceiling. It just has loads of shapes, and when you look up, it's just different. And of course, the natural light coming in. And then the research floor, of course, with these lights coming up from the first floor. I've heard some postgraduates say that the concrete carrels that postgraduates can have here, it's like working at a church altar, and it is a little bit about this. Bill Mackey was in charge of the research floor when it opened, of course, and then he was replaced by Anne Walsh, and the two of them culled books from the colonnades and the other bookstacks areas to fill the shelves there. And there was even a short period, I remember, when Anstis Park, who was Herbert Park's daughter, worked in the research floor for sure. So there's kind of circles there. And of course, we know about these concrete counters, and they are often taken as a sign of the inflexibility of the Berkeley Library. And I said something to this effect one time to David Scott, who was in the French department, and he disabused me totally, because he said, when the Berkeley was opened, it was intended to hold 20 staff. When I had the conversation with him about this, maybe 20 years later, he said, there's 80 staff working in the Berkeley Library now. And he said, if that's not a definition of flexibility, he didn't know quite what it was. And of course, the activities, the general activities in the library are very different now. now to what they were. Just a desk, just looks like an ordinary desk, but actually there's a non-reflective surface there. It's big, it's very, very generous for the time in the 1960s as a library desk. There's still room on it nowadays for a book, a laptop and a notepad. And there's many libraries built, in the 1960s and 70s in the UK that don't have any desks as big as that. And the other thing, of course, is the desk is actually delineated, so every reader knows how much space he has, and you don't cross that space, which is important. We see that happening in the 1937 reading room now, where there are general tables. A student sits down and starts, spreading around to kind of keep it in there. But those little silver lines keep you in your space. And here's an earlier picture of the same desk, in fact, and I just want to point out the chairs here. I don't know how many of you remember these chairs. These were designed, of course, by Paul Correllet. They were bright orange. The staff had blue ones, and my memory is that from the day one, they always squeaked. They had a particular squeak in the reading room, and they always squeaked. And they have this kind of heart shape that is kind of like Arnie Jacobson was producing chairs in the 1950s, a bit like that. And they were only replaced after about 40 years of very hard use by students. And of course, this is one of my favourite chairs. This is the classic Harry Bertoia diamond chairs. And those of you who know about it, they were designed by Harry Bertoia for General Motors, and they're dipped in chrome to mirror the idea of the chrome fenders on the American cars. Is the idea. And as Harry Bertoia was a sculptor, I've seen several of his sculptures in Chicago and other places, and as he said, they're mainly made by air, like sculpture. Space passes right through them. They look most uncomfortable, but in fact they are really, really comfortable for sitting and studying in. But alas, they're all gone from the reading room, bar one or two somewhere. The wires started springing and they stabbed a few students in the leg, and they had to be withdrawn on health and safety. Everything in Berkeley is individually designed. The bookcases, of course, they're made of plywood, really suitable material for bookcases. 50 years later, they're still not sagging. Metal shelves would probably be sagging 50 years later. Certainly, and of course, they're on plinths. Makes it impossible to move them a couple of inches left or right, as architects don't want you to mess up their bit. But when you look at them now, the aisles are really generous. They're wide enough for your standard wheelchair. So I reckon that if we had started putting in new extra shelves in there, we'd probably be taking them out about now to give wheelchair access into the bit. And of course, even the flooring is matching the layout of the shelving with the ribbing on the rubber. And that flooring there, Melonly, I think it's called, is 50 years old now and still wearing very well. There's very few pictures of the library a little bit later than the opening. These are two pictures of a few that Peter Fox took in 1980 for a provost working party. And like the pictures for the funding of the new library at the time, they are designed to show that the library was overcrowded, of course. And this is the cataloguing department. And I have them here to show the way that the cataloguers' desks, again, were individually designed by Paul Correllet. I could see some of the correspondence back and forth. What do catalogers want on a desk? He'd never seen one before. He'd never seen a cataloger before. So they, of course, wanted everything, shelf for every reference books in progress and everything else, of course. And so, it's a bit of a desk designed by a camel, I think, in a way, but never mind. And we have Monica Henchy there in the window. You remember her? I never remember sitting anywhere else but in that seat. And then we have Sue Tucker here, who is a visitor from Reader Services, checking up something on a microfiche catalogue screen. And then we have Assumpta, who's right here with us today. Assumpta, I would reckon, is probably making a banned book, because that was one of her jobs as a young girl before Assumpta got this job. The managing of banned books, I believe, was always given to a married lady. And Margaret Chubb, I think, did it before you. I think, I'm not sure. But here was Assumpta, the young 18-year-old, put in charge of reading Irish Ifigul every week and going through the catalogue and removing the books that had been banned by the Irish censor. And we had received them under English or the UK legal deposit scheme. And so she had to take them out of the thing. Of course, she did it all without reading any of them. But again, it's just to show you the way the desks were hand designed. And then there's even fewer pictures of Ivy Hall in the 1980s. This is from a video taken by Peter Fox before he left in 1994, and Greg gave it to me, and I've taken a still from it. But I never appreciate just how crowded the library was, Ivy Hall was. We had, sorry, what have I done here? Where are we? Yes, we had shelving of reference books down this side. We have shelving of bibliographic books down these windows. The accessions catalogue taking up acres of space in the middle of the floor. And then we had the counter way back, tucked away at the back of the hall. And then we had this card catalogue. And I was looking at the picture, I hadn't realised, but even the card catalogue has been designed on these silvery pedestals by Paul Correlec. So everything was redesigned. And he did say at one stage, I heard at a talk by him, saying that perhaps he had over-designed some of the elements of the library. But their office had nothing else. They had no other projects on the time, so they had nothing else to do except design and redesign. Now, I'm going to finish there. But before I do, there's so much more I could have said. The tunnel linked to the old library is a story in itself, because that all led to the proper electrification of the old library. 1967, it still wasn't fully electrified. And I was accessions librarian at some time, and there was a spillage of cement in the building of the tunnel, and the insurance money came by, and the insurance money was labelled the cement fund. And I remember spending the cement fund in the accessions catalogue. And I said about the card, well, maybe I didn't, the card catalogue was an innovation for the new library. Previous to that, it had been the accessions with the card book catalogue. And so was arranging the books by the Dewey Decimal System, and the introduction of the over-elaborate but wonderful, wonderful Ranganathan numbering system. And that, of course, was a gift from Brian O'Donnell, who was the chief cataloguer after Hazel Hornsby. Periodicals were located in the Morrison Reading Room. Official publications were in the upper basement, where the group study cubicles are now. They were presided over by Stephen Gregory, who also married a library colleague from the cataloguing department, and then later, of course, by John Goodway. The library entrance hall was very dark at the beginning, and this was because there was a door leading into the librarian's office suite, which is now where the Blackstone area is. And this darkness was actually a purpose design feature by Paul Correlec, because he was trying to mimic Front Gate, where you leave the noisy city, go into a dark, small space, and then out into the bright college campus. And that's what he was trying to reproduce in the entrance hall to the new library, and that's what he has done again in the Nassau Street entrance of the Arts building. You have the busy street outside, a fairly narrow tunnel-like effect coming in through Nassau Street and then into the opening there. And I started with a mention of a library romance. And just before I retired, I was asked by this student if she could come and have some wedding photographs taken in the Berkeley Library because of her student association with the building. And she'd obviously done more than just studying in the building, I think. And it was August, and it was a quiet time in the library, and those who know me know I'm a romantic at heart. So there were their names there. And just the library, it's not just a building, it's not just a library. It's also nowadays, it's a front door. And of course, it's a front door to the Usher Library. The Usher Library has no front door. The Berkeley Library is its front door. And I think in 50 years' time, there'll be a similar kind of talk like this about the wonders of the Usher Library, because it is an amazing building in its own right. And just I want to say a few things. An army of people have helped me with this talk, and I'm just going to name a few here. Because Peter Fox's book, of course, has been a major source of information. And not only is his book beautifully referenced with all the manuscript references, when I went up to the manuscripts department, Estelle showed me a list that Peter had left with them of a concordance of manuscripts that refer to the library in general, which is a wonderful thing. So you can see the people there. Greg Sheaf has given me endless images. He's helped me tonight, and all things electronic and information. And I've passed. He's now the Usher tour guide, or the Berkeley tour guider that I used to have it. And then I've had conversations and lunches. One of the great things about being retired is you can have lunches without looking at your watch. But I'm afraid the people I have lunch with sometimes do have to look at their watches, but never mind, not everyone. And then, many colleagues. Thank you very much.